Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first Sunday in Lent. Now, the first Sunday in Lent, it's pretty much a guarantee that we're going to be talking about one of two things: temptation or the devil. Now, this might be the only time that you hear those two subjects brought up all year long. Now, that's because the story of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, it comes up every year in the lectionary. So you get to hear all three versions of it from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They each have unique points of emphasis in their account, so I suppose that there is a good reason for doing this, even if it isn't the most pleasant or edifying subject matter. Now, in fact, one commentary that I read, I saw this pastor, he half jokingly, half seriously referred to the first Sunday in Lent as Satan Sunday. Now, can you imagine if I'd had Karen or Gerald put that on the front of your bulletins? You know, half of you probably would have picked that up and been like, okay, I'm out of here. And I wouldn't blame you. I couldn't say I'd blame you for that. But commentaries, you know, they can be real gold mines, I tell you. And speaking of commentaries, I read one for this week from a theologian that really struck me because it was funny. Now, you don't normally think of a theologian's commentary as being funny. You're lucky if you could stay awake through the whole thing. So this was pretty cool. He was talking about how his son, who was just about 4 years old, had left his children's ministry at the church, and those were the verses that the youth leader was talking about. So basically, it was Satan Sunday for kids. So as they were apparently driving home, the poor kid asks his mom and dad, "What do you guys know about the devil?" So this guy's a professional theologian. He's above my pay grade. And so naturally his mind starts racing. You know, does he tell him about St. Augustine and how evil is just an absence of the good? Does he tell him about process theology? But luckily he remembers that the kid was only 4. So he asks him, "What do you know about the devil?" So the boy says, "Well, the devil talked to Jesus. Then he said, the devil was mean." And then his son's voice dramatically drops to this loud whisper, and he says, "If we were at a store and you and Mom were in one aisle and I was in another aisle and there was candy, the devil would say, 'You should take some.'" Now that story, I mean, it just cracked me up, but it also reminded me of a time from my dark, dark past. It's Lent, so I have a confession to make. I was about that kid's age, and I was in a store called Service Merchandise with my parents. We were in the toy section. And they had this Skeletor action figure that I really, really wanted. But my parents said no. And I had been a brat all day, so it was really no surprise that they said no. But I was really upset. I threw a fit. Didn't help. So later on, when they were looking at something else, I snuck off. And I went back to the toy section, and I grabbed that Skeletor figure right off the shelf. And I thought to myself, I should just take him. Nobody is around, so why not? You know, was it Satan? I don't know, but maybe. I mean, after all, Skeletor was the bad guy in the He-Man cartoons. So I tore open the plastic and I took him out, but right when I was about to put him in my pocket, it hit me. If I steal Skeletor, God's going to be angry at me. I'm going to suffer God's wrath. I don't think I even knew full well what that meant, but I guess my mom had raised me right. I was suddenly terrified that I was either going to get caught or that God was just going to blot out my wretched existence. So I put him back in the package and tried to close it up as best I could and hung it back up on the shelf. And then I just literally ran out of there. And I never tried to steal anything from a store again. But the temptation to stuff old Skeletor in my pocket was so strong that I never forgot that. I mean, I remember it as if it was yesterday. So temptation, just as it's hard to talk about Satan in the church these days, it's just as hard to really talk about temptation. And I think it's because we have a tendency to take it in less than helpful directions from the pulpit. Like, he said temptation. That means he's going to be browbeating us about something, right? What are you doing going into a bar on Saturday night? I mean, don't you know that the earliest Methodists were prohibitionists? Are you fudging your resume a little bit to try to get that promotion? You could go on all day long with this stuff. And then the preacher naturally hits you with this moralistic energy, sinners in the hands of an angry God style. I mean, you guys probably actually remember me reading to you from that last year. God's so angry at all of you that you're only saved by the skin of your teeth. That's where we tend to leave it. But here it is, the first Sunday of Lent, and so I've got two options. I can talk about Satan or I can talk about temptation. So I think this year I'll talk about temptation. Sorry, bear with me. I mean, the thing is, we know that temptations are real and that they can be a part of our daily lives, whether we like to admit it or not. But the urge to stuff Skeletor in your pocket or to go into a bar on Saturday night, even if you feel you probably shouldn't, that's not the main issue here. Those things are important, yes, but those are surface level issues. Now, the main issue when it comes to temptation is mistrust. See, before I talk about the gospel reading, let me just rewind a little bit, all the way back to the book of Genesis, in fact. When Satan was at work in the Garden of Eden, what does he do? He tells them that God hasn't told them everything there is to know. There's that tree over there that you're not supposed to eat from. God's withholding that fruit from you. So what he does is he sows the seeds of mistrust. What else is God not telling us? They eat the forbidden fruit because they feel like God is holding out on them. And then everything is thrown into chaos. When God asks them what happens, they blame each other. And so mistrust now exists between humanity and God and in the relationships between human beings. Everything in the fall has to do with a lack of trust. And now all of creation is a mess because of it. Now this totally reframes the way we look at Genesis and the creation story, doesn't it? And so that brings us to the gospel. Jesus is often called the second Adam for a reason. This is because Jesus undoes the work of the first. The first Adam brought death into the world, but Christ conquers death on the cross. And so that's what the symbolism means there. And for our purposes today, whereas the first Adam gave in to temptation, Jesus does not. Now, most of us, we know the story here. I mean, and you do hear it every year, so I don't need to go into a whole lot of detail. He goes into the wilderness, Satan comes and tries to entice him 3 times. Turn the stones into bread and save yourself from death. Don't trust in God, that God will provide for you. Take matters into your own hands. So Jesus replies, quoting Deuteronomy, man does not live by bread alone. In other words, we're more than just our physical needs. And then he says he'll give him all the kingdoms of the world if he just falls at his feet and worships him. In other words, don't trust that God is in control. Take matters into your own hands. But Jesus replies, quoting Deuteronomy, you shall worship the Lord your God, and only him shall you serve. So in other words, all the power in this world is only so much sand. It's our relationship with God that matters. Then he takes them to the top of the temple and says, throw yourself down. Don't trust God's plan and mission for you here on earth. Just assert your power and take matters into your own hands. But Jesus replies, quoting Deuteronomy, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. In other words, I've surrendered to God's will, so I'm not going to do anything that runs counter to that. So the devil departs, and that's the story as we have it. But there are some other points that I want to focus on today. First, I think it's critical that we consider the location and why these temptations occurred when they did. See, when it says wilderness, you immediately think of like a big forest, tons of tall trees. But no, this was a desert where it's believed that these temptations happened. It's a rough, rocky place that's just full of all these cliffs and caves. It's full of wild animals, and it was full of thieves, and it was completely desolate. There was no food, and there was scarcely any water, and the water that there was, it wouldn't have even been fit to drink. And so Luke is careful to point out that these temptations took place after Jesus had been in this desert for 40 days. 40 days. They come when Jesus is weak, depressed, and just utterly depleted. And guess what, my friends? That's typically when the temptations come to us, too. They come at a time when we're weak, when we're depressed or depleted. I'm going to quote a Trappist monk named Charles Cummings. He says this: the physical desert, with its appearance of unlimited, God-forsaken emptiness, is a symbol of the human experience of the absence of God in our life, and the feeling of being abandoned by him and left to our own resources. In the spiritual life, a desert experience is the feeling of inner emptiness that comes from being somehow cut off from the divine presence that is our deepest sense of satisfaction and fulfillment. So in some, they come at times when it's hard to trust God. I mean, that's the real deal about temptation. You know, temptation comes at the opportune time when you lost your job. Temptation comes at the opportune time when your kid is suddenly in trouble with the law, and you find yourself saying, God, why didn't you protect me from this? Temptation, it comes at the opportune time when you've been praying for a loved one to be healed of something like cancer for months, and then it doesn't happen, and they pass away, and you find yourself saying, you know, God, why didn't you heal him or her? Or you might even say, why didn't you take me instead? But that's not all. The temptations come at the opportune time of the pressures of the world all around us. We so desperately cling to status, this driving desire to have the best home, the best car, the best job. We'll do anything to sustain it. Even the good things in life can be distorted with temptation. You'll take on more and more debt just to create the illusion of a grand lifestyle, and instead of living more modestly, you'll do whatever it takes to get ahead. I used to work in sales. And let me tell you, when I wasn't strong in my walk with Christ, I had no problem exaggerating or even outright lying if it'd land me the sale and a good commission check. And most of my coworkers were the exact same way. In fact, it was so competitive that we'd steal each other's deals all the time. So maybe I never physically stole anything. I may have put Skeletor back up on the shelf, but I had no problem being a total cutthroat when it came to my sales jobs. And all of it boils down to a lack of trust. All temptation boils down to a lack of trust, whether it's in good times or bad. The enemy whispers at us just as he did to Adam and Eve, just as he did to Jesus. Don't trust God to provide for you. Blame God when something goes wrong. The Lutheran theologian David Lewis puts it like this. He says, to the degree that we trust God for our daily needs, for a sense of purpose, for our identity as a child of God, the temptations of the world, frankly, have little appeal. But to the degree that we allow our natural insecurity to lead us to mistrust God, we are open to the possibility, appeal, and temptation of the proposition that it's all up to us, that God is not able to provide, and so we'd better take matters into our own hands. So along those lines, I want you guys to do something for me. I want you to take the pencil that is in your pews, and under the sermon notes, I want you to write the word trust and underline it. And underneath it, I want you to list things where you're confident that you have God's support. It could be things like the love of your family, your job, or even your relationship with God. Now, these are things that you might still, of course, worry about sometimes, but nevertheless, you do trust God with these things. And then underneath that, I want you to write down the word mistrust and underline that. Underneath that heading, see if you can think of at least one thing that you're having difficulty trusting God with. That could be a particular relationship, your job, your health, a decision you have to make about a move, anything that you just feel uncertain about. Maybe you can do this now, maybe you can't. It might be hard to do it with me up here sermonizing. But if that's the case, do it when you have some quiet time to yourself today. But I encourage all of you to do it, to really do it. Take time to think about those two things. And then look at those two lists. Why is it easier to trust God with one thing and not the other? What is it that makes the challenging one different? Are they even all that different at all? Or is it possible that maybe we can trust God more than we thought? You might want to talk about this even with one another. Feel free to bring it up with me at our Bible study on Tuesday if you can make it. Yes, I'm going to throw in shameless plugs for that. And then throughout the week, I want you to just think about this list. Pray about all of it. Give thanks to God where you are trusting in him, and ask God to help where you're struggling to trust him. And that brings me to my final point. We might ask, what's the solution? I tell you, that's why a lot of sermons on this subject actually probably fail. Because they try to prescribe things for beating our temptations, like it's some kind of video game or something, like with the right amount of skill, you can master it and you can beat the game. But that's just not the case. Most of us, we fail. And frankly, it's pretty stupid to try to tell people who are being severely tempted, just be like Jesus in the wilderness, just emulate him. Folks, we can't do it. That's the whole point. We are the first Adam. We are the first Eve. We are the ones who get it wrong. So the real solution is this. It's only found in the Gospel of Luke. It says the Holy Spirit led him into the wilderness. His wandering was holy because it was directed by the Spirit of God, and the Spirit was with him every single step of the way. The Spirit was with him in the wilderness, and the Spirit is with us in the wilderness. So every single thing that you put underneath that header of mistrust, let me just assure you guys today, the Holy Spirit walks with you in that wilderness. Call on the Spirit to give you strength, to trust God. Call on the Spirit to comfort you when you're hurting over these things, where you find it difficult to trust in God. And call on the Spirit to advocate for you when you don't even know what to pray about. And finally, call on the Spirit to give you wisdom and discernment to show you why you may have been led into this wilderness of mistrust. Because I'll tell you this, even our wanderings in the barren and desolate places can become holy ground when we learn to cross that word mistrust out completely. And we remember that we are never alone. The Spirit is always with us. Thanks be to God. Amen.